Welcome to the Tabletop Gaming Guild podcast, a podcast all about the experiences and memories that board games with friends and family can create. On today's episode, we'll be discussing drafting and drafting games. And if you can believe it, gentlemen, we have not actually discussed this topic before. Seems like we should have, but
Seems like we should have, but it is time to rectify our sins. And Dan is going to lead us on this one, right, Dan? This is like one of your favorite styles of games?
So draft is one of the many ways that one can play Magic the Gathering. And Magic the Gathering Draft is one of my favorite Magic the Gathering formats.
I would enjoy playing that with you at some point.
Okay. I'll have to remember that next time I have a pile.
I just want to put that out there right now.
I'll have to find a pile of sealed packs that we can dig into at some point in time.
Well, I'm derailing the conversation a little bit already, but I know that there's the new Dungeons and Dragons Forgotten Realms that is out. That I personally, that would be a great like merging of two of my favorite possible things. Would be to sometimes sit down and do a drafting of that. So just putting that out there.
All right. So before we get too deep in the weeds, let's talk about drafting as a mechanism and the style of games that we're looking at here. So if you're playing with a draft, usually there's some selection of things, usually cards, but sometimes tiles, sometimes dice. We'll get into this. And the players have to take turns picking these items. And by picking an item, they have reserved it for their own use and simultaneously denied it for anyone else's use. In some instances, like a Magic draft, everyone has a pile of cards that they're looking at. Everyone picks a card, and then there's like one less card for the next person. But like everyone starts with the same number of cards, and everyone finishes with 0 cards out of each pack. So everyone's sort of got an equal opportunity to pick cards from all the packs as they rotate around the table.
So yeah, the standard drafting mechanism is you get a hand of cards, you pick one, pass it to the right. Sometimes you do that till there's one card left and you discard it. Sometimes you do it till all gone. And usually on the next round, you pass to the left.
Right. That's called a wheel because the order in which you draft the packs sort of like reverses in the middle. An individual draft round can also be wheeled. So like say there's 4 players and 10 items to pick from. It might be player 1 picks something, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 4 picks again, then 3, then 2, then 1.
And it does make a point to, any definition you look up does make a point to differentiate this from just standard drawing cards. The thing that makes drafting different is knowledge. You see all the cards that you can choose from, and you know what cards you're passing to the next player rather than it being a random.
Right. And in Magic, it is called a Rochester Draft. And this is a kind of draft that does not happen very frequently in Magic anymore because it is time intensive to do. And that's when all the cards are laid out on the table so that everyone can see all the cards as people are picking them. So instead of I have a hand of cards and then you have a hand of cards, but I don't see your cards until you pass them to me. So I don't know what you've picked in a normal draft situation. And what they call a Rochester draft, everyone knows what everyone has picked, hypothetically speaking.
The alternative to that would be a game like Citadel, which has partial knowledge drafting, where the first player gets to see all the cards and then he's passing. So the next player gets to see all the cards, but what the first player chose and so forth.
Right. I was going to bring up Citadels too as one of the classic drafting card games that probably a lot of people are familiar with. Citadels involves a lot of hate drafting, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But, and Citadels has another layer to it where, depending upon the player count, 1 or 2 cards are sort of tucked and nobody sees them. So the first player knows what's pickable. The second player doesn't know what one of 3 possible cards the first player has picked, because the other cards are buried and not in that round at all. Another very bare bones, pure drafting game that I want to dig up before we go into 2 more complex examples is the game Sushi Go. Sushi Go is pure drafting. Everyone gets, there's a pile of cards that gets passed around and everyone picks cards. And the end of each round, you get a score based on what you picked. And then the different cards just have different scoring procedures behind them. I think that it's the Maki rolls. Whoever has the most or the second most gets points for those. if you have the third or fourth most, the Maki rolls are worth nothing. So you kind of have to like kind of pursue them really hard. And then Tapuras only scores if you have two of them. So each pair scores like 3 points, I think, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And there's even one set in there that like you have to lay down. I can't remember what you have to lay down the wasabi. And then with the wasabi, it's whatever the next like nigiri is that you put on top of it. So you have to lay those in a certain order in order to score those. But the Sushi Go is one of the drafting games that I've probably played the most of. It's a very light, very easy to teach party game. And it's an enjoyable game. I've had a good time playing it. And so if you're looking for like a very light, easy entry into drafting, Sushi Go is a good one.
Although you can get some hate drafting in Sushi Go.
Oh, you definitely can.
Which, if you don't know what hate drafting is basically you're taking cards specifically only for the purpose of keeping somebody else from getting it.
Yep.
You know that person needs that. You don't need it to have it.
You don't need it. They need it, but you take it so they don't have it. Exactly.
And in some games, that taking that card may actually hurt you, but it's worth it to keep them from getting it.
If it's worth more to your opponent than it is hurting you, sometimes it is. And this is a feature of Magic the Gathering draft that I enjoy, that I look for in other drafting games. In a Magic the Gathering draft, when you open your second or your third booster, you can see a rare that you won't be able to play because of the color of the card. But you're like, oh man, this would be absolute murder if someone else in this draft pod got it and played it against me. So I'm gonna take it even though I can't play it, to make sure that I don't have to play against it.
That's good stuff. I like it.
Yeah, I don't know if you could really call it a game, but there's a game called Spoons. If I remember right, it's sort of a twist on drafting. It's really, really a super simple game. It's only fun because there's violence involved. But all it is you're trying to make a set of 4, and get one card from the pool, put the pool, and pass it. So it's not strictly speaking drafting, but there is that whole element of what you're passing the other player. You know what they've gotten in the past.
Yep. And then everybody beats each other up on the way to the spoons in the middle of the table.
Yep. There's one fewer spoons than there are players. So the last one to grab a spoon, is out of the game, and everybody else has sore hands.
Absolutely.
Sounds like a weird version of like musical chairs.
It's exactly it. It's a card game of musical chairs, and instead of pushing each other away from chairs, you're grabbing the spoons, and everybody's like smacking each other's hands on the way there. Yep.
Don't play it with forks, so.
Now, a lot of games will use a drafting-like mechanism. I'm thinking of like a display of cards or tiles where the cards or tiles might have differing costs as they go from left to right or right to left. Mm-hmm. That in itself is a kind of draft. The players are paying for the opportunity to claim one of these cards or tiles for themselves, and they're paying a premium for usually the cards that have come out the soonest. I consider that a kind of draft, but I think we should steer away from games that use like that sort of mechanism, because I think draft is more interesting when it's like a free-for-all almost.
Yeah. So like an example of something similar to that you're talking about, like, so a game like Concordia, the marketplace, that's that kind of draft that you're talking about, which is, it is a kind of drafting, but not really what we're focusing on for the full discussion. Yeah,
that's usually defined as like a market mechanic as opposed to a drafting mechanic.
Yeah,
but I could share the similarities.
Yeah, it is also a market mechanic, but strictly speaking, you're also kind of drafting those cards. So.
Yep. No, absolutely. Okay. So, I mean, what is one of the games, Dan, that we want to focus on when talking about drafting?
Well, before we mention any other game, I want to do a call out to a game we've all played together.
Okay.
And that is Chai.
It is Chai, and it was a really fun game.
It was. And there are multiple things that you draft in that game, because you draft both the ingredient tiles and you draft the recipe cards that you fulfill, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain extent, you could also say you draft the ingredients out of the the cupboard.
Yeah, the cupboard mechanic. Yeah, definitely, because everybody can see what's there.
Yeah, there's 5 ingredients that you are known, and you can go there to grab the ones that you need before anybody else grabs them.
Okay, so that's interesting. So there's like 3 distinct drafting bits within the game of Chai.
Yeah, I mean, that one also could be said as leaning towards the market mechanic over drafting. But yeah, I can see, especially the recipe cards.
Mm-hmm.
because the recipe cards don't have any cost. You can grab whatever you want. They're always available. You're not necessarily taking turns. It's one of the possible actions you can take is to take a recipe.
Yeah, and the ingredient tiles have something else going on with them in that game. It's not just a pure draft. You can manipulate the market, which is what it is, to grab a lot of tiles at once for a relatively cheap cost.
Well, should we talk about the obvious one?
Yeah, no, you guys talk about the obvious one.
Well, I mean, I'm sure anybody who's watched this channel, watched a single one of our episodes, knows we love Blood Rage because it's mentioned every episode.
And I was going to say, and James isn't here tonight, everybody. We didn't mention this at the beginning, but James is not here tonight. Are we going to mention the name of the No, we're not going to. So if you've listened to the show and you've heard us talk about Blood Rage, you know who designed Blood Rage.
And that name, we'll make a point not to mention that name at all in this episode.
Nothing against that person. Nothing against that person. Just to needle James a little bit. We will.
We all love that person's
name. We do, but we're not going to mention the name.
I feel the love already.
Absolutely. But I was gonna say, because I was so glad that we're going to talk about Blood Rage, just because, again, everybody, it's the game, one of the games that most recently all four of us were at a table playing together. And but yeah, I like this game a lot, and really interesting drafting stuff goes on in that one when you draft. So
yeah, and that's the one that's hate drafting is important for that game, because there are some strong strategies that come out after you played it especially if you played it with the same group quite a lot. You see which strategies that person prefers, when they're going for that strategy, right? You cannot let them have certain cards to fulfill that strategy once they start building a strong engine towards that.
So I find it interesting in the case of Blood Rage that the drafting happens, at the beginning of the round. And as you're drafting cards at the beginning of the round, you're sort of like shaping your strategy for that round. Because after all, you can only carry one card into the next round, which is nothing practically.
Right.
So let me ask you gentlemen, who are probably a little bit more experienced with Blood Rage than I am, do you feel like you can switch strategies in between rounds and it will still work?
Yes.
Especially between rounds 1 and 2, for sure. You can still make it work. I personally find it hard to switch in between age 2 and 3 towards the end game, but it is possible for sure.
Well, one of the things about that is a lot of the strategies will still get you points passively, even if you switch to another strategy, especially the Loki strategy where you're trying to get your people killed off for points. If you switch strategy second round, you still have those Loki cards. So if your people happen to die, you're still getting the points.
Yeah, for sure.
That's probably one of the most difficult switches to make, is to go from Loki to not Loki, wanting to lose battles to wanting to win them, or vice versa.
But it can really work well because once people get used to you trying to lose battles.
They don't expect you to. Yeah, I see where you're going there. See, that is another feature of Magic Gathering drafts that I have experienced that I want to see in more drafting games, is that you can pivot your decision somewhere in the middle of the draft and still come out okay at the end. There's some drafting games out there where you make a decision out of what you're going to draft at some point relatively early in the process, and the rest of the draft is sort of like on autopilot. It's just like, okay, well, of these 5 things that I can pick up, 2 of them are the only things that are even remotely relevant to what I'm trying to do, and this one's clearly better than the other. So, yoink.
Yeah. Well, since we're going into like the ability to kind of switch strategies throughout, that's probably a good time to transfer into Seven Wonders.
That's another one on my list I wanted to talk about.
So,
I'm interested in hearing more about this one because I've only ever played Seven Wonders Duel. I have not played Seven Wonders yet. So
same basic game, but obviously Seven Wonders plays a lot more players.
Right.
And it works. I haven't had a chance to play it with the big player counts, and I'm told it works a lot better with those. So I've really wanted to play it for a long time as a high player count game. But the key thing in that is you have multiple ways to win. You can win by military victory, just amassing a certain amount of military power, or by technological victory, which is basically set collection, or what are the other ways to win? Obviously, if you don't win either of those ways, there's victory points. I think those are the 3 ways. It just goes to total points at the end. But the key thing is you do have to switch up. If you see someone getting too much military, you have to switch your strategy to get a little bit of that military so they can't get it. So it kind of encourage, not technically hate drafting because it does benefit you too, but it does verge on that. And you do constantly have to adjust your strategy to keep people in check.
One of the things that I enjoyed about Seven Wonders is that to a certain extent, some of the cards are like multifunction, because you can take a card, not because you needed it, but because you just needed to turn it into 2 coins, or you needed to bury it under your wonder, right? So it gives you an out to take the cards that, you know, your opponents obviously need and deny them that, and then do something at least somewhat productive with it.
And it's like, actually, a lot of those things you have to do. So you're just for your strategy is like, and you're just waiting for that card that you don't really want, but you want them to use it, rather than waste a good card that you need to just throw it away for money or bury it for your wonder. But that's pretty much the grandfather of drafting games. Like what most people think of when they talk about it. Drafting is either Seven Wonders or Citadels.
And Seven Wonders, it plays up to 7, which is a large count. And you said you've never had the opportunity to play it at that high of a count?
Yeah, I've only played it with 3, which is not considered a particularly good player count for that game.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Because if you can get all the way up to 7, I feel like probably a good player count would hopefully be around like 5 or so.
All right.
I mean, because 7's hard to get, but man, okay. That's it's just I've not played too many games that go that high player count wise. So
well, we need conventions for that.
Right.
So a drafting game that I have mentioned previously on this channel is called Among the Stars, and I'll mention it again because it's got a couple interesting things going on to it that I think is relevant to our ongoing discussion here. So it's a drafting game. In this game, you're building a space station. There's like 4 or 5 different room types that are color coded. So like you have red is like your military rooms, and then blue is like your command modules, and green I think is like crew quarters, and purple is like the entertainment district. And there's another one I'm forgetting off the top. Yellow is engineering. There we go. Anyways, like a lot of drafting games, you're sort of the cards have abilities on them that allow them to synergize with each other, right? And there are some cards that say, hey, this is worth 1 victory point for every blue card you have in your space station at the end. So they encourage you to sort of like focus your strategy. A lot of the cards have like limits on them, like those ones that are worth 1 point per blue. They max out at 7. So at some point you stop picking blue buildings because they're not worth points for you anymore, which is an interesting way to motivate players to wheel in the middle, right? And then like other games, you can draft a card and not build it. You can turn it into money or turn it into a power station, which gives you power cubes, which is another resource in the game. And then the power station cubes you spend to power nearby rooms that require them, because some rooms have a cost in addition to coins of these power cubes.
Okay, so we talk about, there's another game we talk about a lot in this game that does technically have a drafting mechanic, Terraforming Mars. Now, technically the drafting mechanic is an optional rule, but it is the way I prefer to play. It does make a slightly longer game. So when you draw your initial hand of cards, you would actually draft it, which means you have a better selection. You can actually build a stronger strategy, because one of the things that I find without that drafting is sometimes you get like 3 good cards and then 7 that are late game cards that you don't want in your hand that you're just trying to get rid of. And with your draft, you can actually build a more solid strategy just to start off. The other way of doing that same kind of function is by doing what James does and including Prelude and the corporations, and kind of giving you the extra boost to start off with.
So it's just at the beginning of the game that the drafting takes place. And then after that, there's no drafting after that.
Right, just at the very beginning of the game.
Okay. So, are there multiple games out there that do something similar, where there's drafting is a mechanic in the game, but it's not the mechanic of the game?
Games that use like unique player powers might have a rule in the rule book where the players, determine an order by which they pick their faction, right?
Okay.
That could be seen as a form of draft in those asymmetric games, I suppose.
Okay.
A lot of those type of games also give that as a variant rule, where you could, instead of like randomly distributing roles, you can draft. But
so I was gonna say, so as we were getting ready for this episode, I was doing some research and trying to figure out what are drafting games that I have played that are listed, either on BGG or somebody else's list that they've put together. And a game that I saw on the list that I think surprised me a little bit was Wingspan. So I understand, and I've played Wingspan a bunch. Knowing the definition of drafting, I don't think I would have picked Wingspan as a drafting game, though I understand, I guess, that there maybe is a little bit of drafting in the game where you have the cards in the middle of the board, and one of the things that you can do is pull a card from the board, and so that's kind of a shared drafting deck that you can pull from. But having played games like Blood Rage or Sushi Go, where drafting is like a good portion of the game, it just doesn't feel almost like enough drafting to be considered a drafting card game. I don't know how do you guys feel about that?
I saw Wingspan on the list as well as a drafting game, and my immediate thought was that's a drafting game. The only rationalization is you're drafting food from the bird feeder and possibly the bird cards from the display. And that's the only thing I could think of that you're drafting.
I think it's referring to the birds from the display, but
I hadn't thought about the bird feeder though. But
I would, if you almost need another term. It would have to be like market drafting. So it's a type of drafting, but it's different. It's not what you would traditionally consider.
Yeah, because even the opening hand when you start the game of Wingspan, you get 5 cards and 5 pieces of food, and then you have to determine what cards am I going to keep for my strategy and what pieces of food am I going to keep for my strategy. But it's not like you're trading that with other players and each person's taking a thing. So yeah, I'm with Nathan. I feel like there's maybe some kind of medium term that could like tie together marketplace and drafting. So like I said, I was just a little surprised to see that one listed. As much as I personally have enjoyed playing Wingspan quite a bit, that has nothing to do with this conversation. This conversation is, I don't feel like it's really much of a drafting.
Right. Yeah. If you're too loose with your definitions, you could pretty much include almost every game.
Right. I think that's exactly where I'm starting to feel. I'm like, you gotta, there has to be at least some standard.
And that is actually a pretty common complaint on BGG. Is like things that they put into genres don't make any sense. It's just because one person considered it that, so they tagged it, or a certain number of people.
Dan, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, while we're on the topic of variance on drafting, I wanted to bring this up. So there's a mechanic in board game. It is sometimes referred to as action drafting. Now, in action drafting, you have an array of actions that are available to a player, and the first player gets first pick of these actions, and by picking an action, they have locked it out for the rest of the play group for the duration of usually the round. This mechanic is also commonly referred to as worker placement. So how do you guys feel about worker placement, aka action drafting?
That's so weird. I would never have thought to call worker placement like action drafting. I mean, now that you've explained it, I get it. Oh gosh.
I get it, but it's not drafting. I love worker placement. It is not drafting.
But is it?
It is. I think it is a kind of drafting, but it's a very specific kind of drafting. In a lot of worker placement games, the choices that you have round around don't change or don't change much. A lot of worker placement games include the ability to build buildings which add more worker placement spots. That's just a feature of the genre. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, your choices don't exponentially increase over the course of the game. And in a lot of drafting games, your choices also don't exponentially increase over the course of the game. Really, you get a hand of cards for the first draft if there's multiple rounds of drafting. Your second hand of cards, like in Sushi Go, will look very much similar to
Sushi Go is going to look almost exactly the same.
It's going to almost exactly the same. In Blood Rage, you have a different deck of cards for each round, and that's so the game can ramp up a mentioned up. So you see cards that are a little bit more powerful in round 2 and a little bit more powerful in round 3, right? In Among the Stars, the game that I mentioned earlier, there's no division of the stack by rounds. Everything's shuffled together, so you'll see anything in any given round.
I'll get this sidetracked a little bit. I just found something that I have to comment on. In the drafting games listed on BGG, they mentioned an expansion for Seven Wonders Duel. Seven Wonders Duel Solo.
Yeah, I saw that.
Is it Duel anymore if it's solo?
If you count the game playing against you as another entity, sure.
Okay.
I've played the solo version of Seven Wonders Duel. It's well put together, but yeah, no, it's like I guess I'm dueling against the game. It's duel in that way, but not duel as in you thinking two people.
So we sort of danced around this little issue, but I'm just going to come out and say this.
Yeah.
In a lot of drafting games, there's a certain synergy between cards. So that when you pick a card or tile or whatever it is you're dealing with, you're incentivized to pick certain other items later on in the draft because they're going to synergize with what you've already picked.
Right. Yeah. It's that strategy that you're building.
Right. And some drafting games will build you like a miniature engine, like Among the Stars or Blood Rage.
Mm-hmm.
And some drafting games, you're just trying to make sets, and that's more like Sushi Go. Let's talk about Citadels some more and hate drafting, because Citadels is probably one of the best examples of hate drafting I have ever seen.
Okay, this is going to be brand new for me, everybody. I'm listening in close to Dan and Nathan now.
In the game of Citadels, there's like 9 cards, I think? 8 or 9.
Correct. I think it's 9.
That's it?
Yeah, there's 9 cards, but they're drafted each round of the game. And the cards represent a role. So if you pick card 3, I think it is, that's the king, and that's the player who goes first in terms of trading coins or buying buildings. So card number 1 is the assassin, and when the assassin takes their turn, they get to pick a role, not a player, a role, and say that role doesn't get their turn, period.
Whoa.
And then card number 2 is called the thief, I think. And the thief gets to pick a role, not a player, a role, and says, hey, whoever this role is at the beginning of your turn, when you reveal your role, I get all your gold coins, which means you're probably not going to be able to build that turn, which is like half your turn. So there's at least, and there's another card that's, I think it's the Warlord, that's card 8 or 9 that blows up a building. But there's at least 3 cards that literally time walk, aka remove a turn from your opponent by picking them and picking the right player at the right time. So it is pretty harsh game.
I feel like this group needs to play this game.
Yeah, we definitely should at some point.
It's basically shares some similarities to Love Letter, but it's definitely a lot meaner.
It can be mean, yes.
Oh, just ask Eric Summerer, and you've seen any videos where Citadel is mentioned, you'll know what I'm talking about.
I'm gonna have to look more into this game. It sounds very interesting.
The basic concept of the game is you're trying to build up a kingdom. You do this by collecting gold coins and drawing cards, and there's like building cards in the middle of the table that you can lay claim to. And after a certain number of building cards are built, I think that's based on the number of players, somebody can declare a victory or can trigger the end game. Victory is determined by victory points. And like, a building that costs 6 is also worth 6. So you can build a lot of cheap buildings and try to trigger the game early, try to win when you're ahead, or you can build, big buildings and try to be ahead when someone triggers the end game. One of those.
Yeah, it's a small, quick game.
But it is brutal.
Yeah, but a game is usually about 20 minutes, I think. And this is another game that can play a lot of players.
Yes.
According to BGG, it can play up to 8. I'm not sure I'd want to play it with 8, but but the other nice thing is generally if you buy this game, it comes with a couple little expansions, which basically has variant cards that you can swap in and out.
And some of the variant cards do different things than the core game cards. Some of them are a little less hateful than skipping someone's turn. That's
and the
sure.
ones that are less hateful, we're not playing with, right?
Right. Absolutely. We're doing that. If we sit down to Citadels, we'll do core Citadels to start for sure.
It's like Dominion. It's like if I play Dominion with my brother or his kids, you have to have the nasty cards and you have to have the Sea Hag or the Village or whatever.
Fair enough.
He says most of the time when he plays that with his daughters, everybody's in negative points.
So do we want to talk about drafting dice now?
Sure. Off the top of my head, but I'm sure you do.
All right. Well, there's one that comes to mind immediately. So we were all given keys, correct, for Sagrada from Direwolf Digital.
That is correct.
Sagrada is a dice drafting game, and it's actually, I think, pretty well put together one. So in Sagrada, you're building these beautiful stained glass windows. The actual physical game includes transparent dice representing the panels that you're putting into your stained glass windows, you're given a card at the beginning of the game, and the card has like colors and numbers on it. And it's sort of like not all the squares on the card have colors and numbers on it. Some are just blank. But as you're drafting the dice, you're trying to fill in these spots. So you have to put a 5 where there's a 5 on your board, and you have to put a purple where there's a purple on your board, and you can't put 2 purples next to each other, and you can't put 2 3s next to each other, or any of the other colors or numbers. So you have all these restrictions about how you can place your dice. And yet, in my half dozen plays of the digital implementation of that game, I have not found, I think I've whiffed maybe one round where there was a die that I couldn't place on my board, but it was the last round of the game, so meh. And one of the cool things about the game is that in addition to all those restrictions, you have like 3 objectives that you're pursuing, including one objective that is private. So you have multiple ways that you can score points, and you can pursue, just 1 or 2 or 3. I don't think you really want to try for points across all 4 objectives, but if you manage to get a couple points across all 4, but really go deep on 1, you're probably in good shape, I feel. But I think that game does use like a wheel draft. So at the beginning of each round, you roll a number of dice equal to the number of players times 2 plus 1, and then the players pick dice in turn order. And then they reverse, and then there's 1 die left over that gets just tossed aside and used as a marker on the round track, so then you know what round you're in.
Yeah, I played Ganchan Clever not too long ago, and that has an interesting take of dice drafting. It's actually somewhat similar to Sagrada, I believe, but in Ganchan Clever, the main player rolls his dice, and he gets to draft all the dice he wants first. He can only draft once he's done drafting, whatever's left over, everybody else gets to use. So it's kind of like a single player drafting, if that makes any sense at all. But yeah, so you're basically balancing, okay, what's best for me, but I don't necessarily want to leave good things behind that other people can use.
I'm assuming that in that game there's some restrictions as to what the first player can pick for themselves. So in some cases they have to leave certain things.
Well, they always have to leave of the same number of dice. So you're always drafting the same number of dice, and you're always leaving the same number behind. But you also, it's a rolling right. So if you've already filled a category, you can't take that same place again. You have to figure out other ways to fit it in. So if you have a certain number and a certain color that you've already used, you may end up having to leave that for somebody else. Every time you pick a die, you're re-rolling the ones you have left, and so you're not exactly sure what you'll be leaving, 100% sure what you'll be leaving behind. But as you get close to that end, I lied. I did misspeak. You're not always leaving the same number of dice behind. When you pick a dice, you have to get rid of all the dice that are lower numbers than the one you pick, and those will go. So you could actually leave more than you would like behind, but everybody else is only picking one of those dice to use. But I do feel like dice drafting is a popular mechanic for roll and writes in particular, just because it's simple. Everybody can clearly see the information that's available. You don't have to have text.
I've got something to say about roll and writes shortly, but before we get to roll and writes, I've got one dice drafting game to throw in Peter's general direction. So Pete, this game is called Role Player, and in this game you're drafting dice to build a D&D style character.
This is a game that has been on my radar for a little while now, and I know that they've done at least one other version of it. Can't remember if James mentioned that he had tried it or not, because they've got Role Player, and then I think they did one called like Name of the Wind, which is maybe based with Patrick Rothfuss's King Killer Chronicles series. They kind of like merged those IPs together. But yes, Role Player is a game that I've seen, I have not yet played, and would really enjoy, because again, this is, the whole game is making your D&D character, but by dice drafting. Which I just think could be a lot of fun. And I'm assuming you're just trying to have the most optimized character.
Pretty much.
So you're playing against other people, and you want your character to be the most optimized, I'm assuming. So
yeah. So at the beginning of the game, you have, I think it's it's a class. There's like 2 or 3 boards that you add to your player board that determine like your goals. And one board says, hey, you want dice of these particular colors. And the other board says, hey, you want your stats to total these numbers or better. And there's another board that says, hey, you want your alignment to be here, right? And you get points for all of these things at the end. At the end of each round of dice drafting, there's also, you get to pick equipment, and the equipment can help build out your character as well, since like an armor set can be worth points as well.
So I believe the game Peter was referring to is Role Player Adventures, which is coming out this year.
It may be. I thought there was one that was already out with Name of the Wind IP involved, but I could be totally wrong on that. So
maybe I don't see that. They have a couple like games in the role player universe. There's Lockup, and then there's Role Player Adventures, which is basically, I believe, actually taking those D&D characters and playing a game with them. So it just continues the next step.
That's right. Because that one I just heard about. So if anybody else, again, listening to the podcast, we know that we like Stonemaier games. And we even had an episode where we interviewed Jamie Stegmaier, right?
Yep.
So he just released like twice a year, he does a top 10 games, whatever, where he is at this time in his life. It's his top 10 favorite games. One of them is Role Player currently. He mentioned in his top 10 list, and he was super excited about this expansion that Nathan just mentioned, because all of a sudden you could use the character that you've created and play another game with it. And that was one of the ones he mentioned. So that just brought that to mind.
Yeah, I've not yet played Role Player. I've had it on my list of games I'll play for a long time too.
So I guess we're going to go back to roll and writes for just a little bit, right? I currently own Lagrangia, no Siesta, and I previously owned Lagrangia. So both these games involve drafting dice. They're both like farm builders in a general sense. Lagrangia, the dice drafting is just a small piece of the game. It's like something you do and like the second phase of the turn after you collect your income. There's a couple dice for you to draft that gives you a couple extra resources. And like, it's just one of the many ways you collect resources and manage and build your farm in that game. Lagrangia no Siesta is a dice drafting roll and write style game in a very traditional sense, where the dice, instead of having like numbers on them, have resource icons on them, and you're trying to accumulate resources to tick off boxes on your score sheet and get sets of, this kind of resource or that kind of resource, or fill out, carts and ship goods and various other things. In both these games, however, there's an interesting choice in the dice draft. Say just at 2 players, just as an example. Player A picks a die. Player B picks a die. Player A picks a die. Player B picks a die. But then there's 1 die left that all players have access to, right? And the important thing is it's player B, aka not the first player, the second player to have picked, that gets to pick what that die is that everyone gets. So the first player gets to pick what they need from the choice of all possible 5 dice. The second player gets to pick what everybody gets, including themselves, which is kind of important sometimes.
Yeah, I haven't played either of those, but I'd like to. I suppose I should talk about Dice Hospital. It's a game I played, but I wasn't thrilled by, but it has a slightly different take. Very slightly different take on dice drafting, where you're drafting basically ambulances, and the ambulance have sets of dice in them. And I can't remember whether low numbers are good or high numbers, but basically the dice will change the numbers at each round, and eventually your die will represent a patient that's died if you haven't treated it. And so you want to make sure you're getting the ambulance with the healthiest people generally, but sometimes you might want to take a couple unhealthy people just to make sure you get the good ones that you really want. So it's a little bit of, it's just different in that you're drafting sets rather than individual dice. Well, one thing to talk about is, for being a popular mechanic, there really aren't that many games that use drafting as a major mechanism. I've pretty much talked about every single one I've played.
I was gonna say, because as I was going through BGG's listing, I think I wrote down like 6 or 7 from their list that I have played, and a couple of those from the list were like Wingspan, where I was like, I don't know if I really consider it to be a drafting game.
Yeah.
And so it seems like I think it's a fun mechanic. I've enjoyed the games a lot. The ones that I have played that include it, I've really enjoyed. But I wonder why it is then that it's not as highly utilized as some other mechanics out there. Do you guys have any thoughts on that, or like why it's not as highly utilized?
Well, let me talk about the ways in which drafting games can fail.
Oh, okay.
So drafting is an interesting mechanism, and it totally works when it is done right. But for me personally, there's many ways in which a drafting mechanism can fail. One of those ways is if there's no motivation to reconsider your options in the middle of the draft. So like in a typical Magic Gathering draft, for example, your first couple picks out of your first pack, you're very open. You don't know what strategy or what color combination you might necessarily end in. By the middle of the first pack, you've probably decided on 2 colors, usually, that you're in. And at that point, you're kind of like more on cruise control, because each new pile of cards that you're looking at, you're only looking at 1 or 2 cards instead of the full pack, because you're only looking at cards that are in your color palette. And that happens in a lot of drafting games where you can blank a large number of the selections that are in front of you, and the decision tree becomes less complicated, but also less interesting. But if a game includes the availability for you to switch gears in the middle, then you can be like, oh man, what is this crazy card that has just got passed to me? Do I want this? Oh man, no, I totally want this. I am now going to do this for the rest of the draft. And you can come out at the end having done that thing. And even though your first several sometimes picks were not that thing, you did okay, right? You did more than okay in some cases.
That's important, but I think Blood Rage is a good example of the strengths and the weaknesses of drafting.
Proceed.
Because the biggest thing about drafting, what does it do? It gives you information. You know what you could potentially have in the future as the drafting goes around, but you also know what everybody else could potentially have. And yeah, that's great for experienced players. But that does, 1, it adds a lot of time. 2, it adds a massive learning curve. It doesn't give you any value to know what the other players have if you don't know what that means. So you have to learn all those cards to be able to successfully draft.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially with a game where the cards are a bit more complex. Magic the Gathering, incredibly complex for me anyways, the few times that I've played it, because the cards, what they do can be so different. I mean, you've got a game on the other end of the spectrum with Sushi Go. They don't change. Everything's the same. There's maybe only like 7 different cards, if that, in the whole thing. Very quick and easy to learn. Magic the Gathering is a game that's been going on for, is it 30 years at this point? 20 some years? It's been around for a while.
It's 30 some for sure.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to say it's quite a few years. And
95
years. 95
okay.
years.
Since 95. Since
95. Okay. So quite a long time that this game has been around. And so they've come up with a ton of different cards that do different things. And so for me, when you sit down for a game of Magic, all of a sudden it's like, well, I've got to read these cards now to see what they even do. And again, Blood Rage, I feel, is like in the middle of that, where you play it enough, you eventually recognize the cards, you know what you're going to be. But that very first time you play Blood Rage, same kind of feeling, because you're like, I don't know. Like all of a sudden I hear Nathan over there talking about the Loki strategy. I don't even know what that is. And no matter how much you learn how the mechanics of the game is played out, actually having the cards and reading them and trying to figure out what they do, and being like, oh, I don't know what I just gave Nathan. I don't know that that's his favorite card in the whole game, because it didn't make sense to me when I read it just now. So there's definitely, I'm with you guys, there's a level of difficulty depending on what game you're playing that's using this drafting mechanic. The mechanic itself, not that difficult. The way it's implemented from game to game has varying levels of difficulty. And like Dan said, then there's sometimes you get tied in and does it fail because it's not fun anymore. You're just slotted into your thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
I do feel like you've understated the difficulty of Magic the Gathering.
Oh, I'm sure I have. I've only played Magic like a handful of times. This is the guy who's not played it that much. So
you don't have to just be able to read the cards. You need a dictionary to define all the terms.
Yeah, the terms, the iconography that's part of the game. I know I've understated it because I've only played it a handful of times and I'm not very good at it. So, but that doesn't mean I don't want to play it more. I do.
If I'm not mistaken, it doesn't even come with rulebooks anymore.
There's something called the basic rulebook, which is available on their website as a PDF.
Yes.
And I don't think it's included in any of the boxed sets or products that are available on the shelf. There's something else called the comprehensive rulebook, which you really should not delve into unless you're somebody like me.
A masochist?
A judge.
Yeah. No, he said it right the first time.
So another way in which drafting games can fail for me is if they don't recognize if they don't realize rather the incentive to hate draft. So a lot of like more Euro style games, there's very little player interaction and you're sort of encouraged to do your own thing, just do the best for you, don't worry about what everyone else is doing, right? So I think that's a bad thing for drafting games. In drafting games, you have to worry about what other people are doing, A, and B, you have to realize, oh, this is so good that even if it's terrible for me, I have to make sure that Nathan doesn't get it. Or I have to make sure that James doesn't get it. I mean, that's the most important thing, is that James does not get it.
It does definitely add a potential for meanness. And, if you have some touchy groups, you just might want to make sure there's nothing they can throw nearby.
Having hate drafts as part of your game engine expands the decision tree again. So like if you put on your blinders and are only looking at green and white cards, you can be like, wait a second, what is this black card that's like 7 mana and it's going to destroy me, right? Yeah. You suddenly, this is caught out of the corner of your eye because you realize it's something powerful.
Yeah, I totally agree. You have to have that potential for hate drafting in drafting games, because otherwise you run the risk of getting a hand of cards where it's all garbage for you. It's like, it does nothing for you. You have to take it. You don't care if you don't care about what the other players are doing. It's like, you don't care if it's hurting them. But if you throw away card.
Yeah, if you don't care what's going on the other player's game, you're probably not going to win, because they could be doing something over there incredibly awesome. And if you're not paying attention and ready to rob them of the card they need to fulfill their goal, then you're not fully playing the drafting game. The drafting game is not just I get cards for me. It's I get cards for me and I stop cards that you need from you. And that's from games as difficult as Magic to as simple as Sushi Go. If I know that you're going for Maki rolls and you're already winning the game, I want to stop you from getting Maki rolls, even if I'm not doing that. Part of the reason that you have the knowledge you have is so that you can use that knowledge to the best possible way.
Part of what I was trying to get at, it gets that satisfaction of, rather than saying, oh, I got a worthless card.
Yeah.
Oh, this card's not good for me, but somebody else could for sure use this card, so it's stopping them. So you always have some sort of satisfaction from any card you get.
Yeah, I think the example of Maki rolls there was rather good, because Maki rolls only scores if you're first or second.
Mm-hmm.
You might take Maki rolls even though you're not going to get first or second to mess up one of the other players.
Yeah, whoever's going to get first, maybe I want them to get second instead. It is just, and I know that we call it hate drafting, which makes it sound bad, but it is just as much a part of the game as anything else when you're playing a drafting game. Because if you're not playing, I don't think if you're not playing both spectrums of that, then you're not playing the full spectrum of a drafting game.
Right. Yeah. But there are drafting games out there that sort of play closer to the Euro optimization puzzle, where really the best thing you could do is just to take the card that's best for you, whatever that is.
Right. But I'm with you, though. I feel like that causes it to be not as fun of a drafting game.
So basically, anybody designing a drafting game has to factor in the potential for direct confrontation that drafting introduces.
Mm-hmm.
And that can alienate some gamers. Some gamers don't like direct confrontation.
Oh, absolutely.
So that has to be consideration when you're designing. And I can see why, if you want to make a game that's as accessible to as many players as possible, you may not want to do drafting. For that reason, and for the reason I mentioned as far as the learning curve that it introduces.
Two thoughts here. One, I think drafting in terms of player interaction is direct only when everyone sees all the things that can be picked, right? And it's more indirect if you don't know what is being picked ahead of you.
Yeah, I can understand that. So Blood Rage, you don't see everything right away. If Nathan is like two players ahead of me in the circle, I don't know what card he just pulled until that hand goes the rest of the way around and I've had a chance to look at what's left. So there's always a little bit in that game where I'm not 100% sure what he's got going on, what strategy he's probably decided on until we start actually playing cards later.
Well, somewhat true.
Yeah, I mean, the person right after me, I know what cards I gave them. And the person right before me, I know what cards they gave me. But if you've got like a 4-player game, I feel like there's at least one person that I'm a little bit less sure of.
Well, if you're playing with just the base game, with no expansions,
yeah,
and you've played enough, you know every single card that's available.
If you've played enough.
And that's kind of where you have to be to play a drafting game well. You have to know, well, it really helps to know all the cards that could be out there. And if you're playing base Blood Rage, you kind of have to know every card that they could have taken. So when you see the cards that get past you, you say, oh, they probably took this card.
So I feel like again, like most games, the game becomes better the more you've played it.
Yeah.
And in a drafting game, as with most games, the first time you play it, if you don't go into it with like 100% knowledge, you're probably going to not win. You might still do fine, but you're probably not going to win. But again, I think that's not just drafting games in general, that's games in general.
But that's also why I always play Blood Rage with the expansions, because I like that certain amount of uncertainty. I don't like the 100% knowledge. I like some uncertainty. So when you have the expansions, there's certain cards that are randomly taken out because you're still drafting the same number of cards, but you now have more cards potentially to draft from.
That was going to be my second point here, actually, was that knowledge of the card pool is definitely beneficial when playing drafting games. I don't think that you necessarily need to know the full set of cards that are available in the draft to be able to participate and do well necessarily, but like knowledge of the metagame, what is possible within the framework of the game is certainly something that the game is testing you on if you're drafting. And that's true of Magic as well.
That's why when you're teaching Blood Rage, the first thing people usually will tell you about is the Loki strategy, so you know not to let them take that strategy.
Also, the Loki strategy is kind of it's an easier it's a nice low-hanging strategy for the newbie of the group because they're not pressured to win battles.
Yeah. I mean, it gets touted as this unbeatable strategy. It's not really. It is a strong strategy that's easy to do, and there's a lot of options, flexibility to it. But for experienced players, there's some other strategies that are really powerful too. It just takes a little bit more skill to pull off. Yeah, we could probably talk about Blood Rage for the rest of the episode, but I suppose we should move on to something else.
Well, I have also actually mentioned all the drafting games that were on my list that I have actually played. There were only 8 or 9 of them.
So I think what we're saying, everybody who's listening, is that we really like drafting games, and there need to be more of them.
Sure.
So whoever's out there listening, and you're like, man, what's a great mechanic that needs more games, more really great games? I think it's drafting. So get out there, make some games.
So whenever somebody designs a game based on us, there you go. That drafting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
You got to have that Tabletop Gaming Guild board game with drafting.
Yeah, with drafting involved.
And there has to be a betrayer. And the betrayer
is always James. It's always James. Always James.
Just name the card James. You don't even have to say the word betrayer.
No, it's just the James card.
Yeah.
I could talk about the bread strategy in Magic Gathering drafts.
I have no idea what that is.
No, what is this?
It's a framework.
You said it's called bread?
Bread.
I'm sold because it's bread, but other than that, I don't know anything.
For those of you who are not familiar with it, in Magic Gathering drafts, an easy way to piece together your deck while drafting is to think of bread.
Okay.
So this is an acronym.
I think about bread all the time anyways. So.
Yeah, this is an acronym. B stands for bombs. A bomb is any card that can pivot the game on its head. Usually it's a large, flashy creature or a power bomb sorcery that's just going to totally reverse the game. Second, if there's a bomb in the pack, you want to pick it, basically. If there isn't a bomb in the pack, then you go to R. R stands for removal. So Magic Gathering drafts are primarily a creature-based format. So any card that can answer a creature counts as removal, mostly by killing it or blowing it up in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
There's kinds of cards in the game called like combat tricks that, they're like instants that can buff your guys. Those can be like situational removal, but they're not like super good. The E stands for evasion. So you're looking, if there isn't bombs and there isn't removal, you're looking for evasion. Evasion is always a creature that is hard to block in some way, shape, or form. So in Magic Gathering, this is like flying. Flying creatures can't be blocked except by other flyers or with another ability called Reach, Menace, Trample. These are all abilities that creatures can have that make them harder to block. This is pretty important when the goal of the game is trying to get your opponent down to 0 before they can do the same to you. The A stands for anything good, which is kind of a nebulous category. But like, if you don't have bombs, you don't have removal, and you don't have evasion in the pack, you're just looking for cards that are decent, that will go into your deck and do what your deck wants to do. So most frequently, these will be creatures that are like on the middle of your mana curve, like 2, 3, maybe 4 mana, and have decent bodies and or abilities associated with them. And then the D stands for dregs. So the dregs represent the cards that are probably useless for your deck, but you've got to pick a card, right? So if you're down to D, you're probably looking to draft a card, not because you can use it, but because somebody else can use it. So you're doing a low tier hate draft if you're looking at dregs, or you just pick up a card because, I need this, I don't know, artifacts and equipment are actually higher tier than dregs because they're colorless and can be put in any decks, but they're just miscellaneous things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like that's a framework for basic Magic Gathering drafts. There's ways you can draft your decks that aren't that, for sure, and there are probably some better ways to think about Magic Gathering drafts, but there you go. There's a framework for drafting, and I would say it's a pretty good one, because if a game has all those different roles among the cards in its card pool, you have a decent number of like choices for you as you're picking.
Okay, that's
well. I feel slightly more prepared for when we do get together to play some drafting Magic the Gathering. I'm a little bit more prepared now, though. So thank you for that.
Well, I think we've pretty much exhausted this topic, so maybe we should wrap up with a stupid game. So since we're doing drafting, I'll do a little draft. We have to pick these out of these 3 drafting games.
Mm-hmm.
You can only keep one. You have to sell one to a friend, which you could play occasionally, and sell one to a complete stranger, which you'll never see again and never get to play again.
Okay.
Your choices are between Terraforming Mars, Blood Rage, and Wingspan.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Good picks. Good picks.
How do we decide who gets to go first in this drafting, or are we each just drafting from the same 3?
We're each drafting from the same 3, so it's not a true draft.
All right. Sounds good. I mean, I'll go first because for me it's probably pretty simple, and I know it'll be at least different from Nathan's. So I'm going to keep Blood Rage. I am going to sell to a friend Wingspan. I'm going to sell to a complete stranger Terraforming Mars.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
All right, I'll go next, right?
Yeah.
So I am going to keep Terraforming Mars, but I'm never going to draft Terraforming Mars. I'm just going to keep it because I love that game. I'm going to sell Blood Rage, and I'm going to sell to a friend Blood Rage. Mm-hmm. I'm going to sell to a complete stranger Wingspan. My reasoning there is that I know I have some friends that are big fans of Blood Rage among the fellow podcast students, so I'm sure it'll get to the table more than a couple times. And then Wingspan as good as it is also an engine building style game, and I have a lot of those in my collection. So
yeah, even I'm not really perfect. I think I have to go with Dan. It would hurt so much. Sure. Wingspan's so hard. It would be so hard to part with. I love Wingspan, but Terraforming Mars is something I couldn't go without ever playing again. And Blood Rage, I think James would murder me if I never played it again.
Terraforming Mars, I still have only ever played Terraforming Mars once. It hasn't reached a level of love for me because I've only played it the one time. So yeah, I could definitely see it becoming more of that for me eventually, but we'll see. I thought Nathan was gonna say, okay, we have to do this, but then one of us was randomly gonna go first. Who was gonna get stuck with what at the end? So but, yeah.
I didn't put in that much thought into it.
No, okay.
Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback for us, feel free to visit us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or Board Game Geek Guild 2989, or our website at tabletopgamingguild.com. Don't forget to like, follow, and or subscribe. Tabletop Gaming Guild is a product of Tabletop Gaming Guild LLC. All rights reserved.